It is really great to see all of you and to see this many people. I think the Bay Area had the biggest regional conference we've ever had, and this might have surpassed it. So for everybody that was part of the organizing committee, etc. I do have to say a couple things about Kathy Orlinsky. So Kathy organized this conference last year, but nobody ever asked to do this again. It just doesn't happen. Organizing is way too brutal. 3 years ago, I was down at the conference, our first conference in Missouri that attracted the states around there, and George and Kathy Lauer were the organizers. And at the end, George said, "I'd just like to say a few things." He said, first of all, Kathy and I have decided that we're going to stay with each other. And we've decided we're going to stick with CCL. And that's, I organized the first national conference, and each one of those almost killed me. It's a crazy undertaking, and it's not just all the details and all the logistics. What you're dealing with is the constant dread of everything that isn't going to work. We had the first conference we had in Austin, we were locked out of the room in winter for the morning. So we did the presentations outside in winter. And you're always convinced that those kinds of things are going to happen and that the speakers aren't going to show up and nobody's going to register. So it's not just everything that needs to be managed. It's somebody who's willing to take on the constant dread of it's not going to work out. And so I remember talking to Kathy at the end of the conference last year, and I was kind of like, whew, we survived. And she's like, this was great. I'm going to do it again next year. So, yeah, Kathy, you are truly extraordinary. And I know that Kathy's going to get a chance to thank the whole team this afternoon, but if we could just give her one more hand, I'm really in awe of her. So I know that few minutes ago we found out who were people who were here the first time. How many of you were here last year? How many of you were here last year? Okay, I'd like you to just see if you could remember what it was like when we got here last year. Because it was a few days after the inauguration, and as I'm walking and greeting people, people have one of two looks at me like, should we still be doing this? And the other look is, I hope something works out here. And for my own psyche, the difference between how it was walking in and coming out was extraordinary. It gave me an enormous amount of wind in the back of my cells to get me through a year. It was a really powerful experience. So I was thinking that, I think it's probably pretty obvious to all of us that in terms of yours and my well-being, it's probably better to get together with other CCLers than to yell at cable TV shows. I think I actually read that in the New England Journal of Medicine last week. Either that or in my talking notes. Which one was it, Taylor? Was it the New England Journal of Medicine or was it my notes? It was my notes, okay, all right. So anyhow, I'm thrilled to be here with you. It does really good things for me to get a chance to be here with you, and I'm grateful for that. I also want you to know that for this year's regional conferences, I'm not planning on being moved to tears. Now, you know how like some people in yoga, they say you only have a certain number of breaths? I think that maybe I only have a certain number of cries left. And that I might need one at an important moment. So I don't have a plan, but it could happen. I have been known to be moved by all of you. I do want to just go over a little bit about how we've organized some of our priorities for this year. So one of the things we do is twice a year we get together as a staff and we say, okay, what do we, how should we be developing the organization? What should we be focused on? You have that, Taylor? And so we identified 4 key areas and 2 sub-areas that we want to work on this year. So one is obviously conservative recruitment. We added about 2,000 or 3,000 conservatives to the organization last year, which was fantastic. But if we're going to enact a bipartisan solution, and we're committed to that, we're going to need to continue to recruit more conservatives. Second is grassroots, more endorsements. We found that the endorsements from community leaders, from business leaders, from chambers of commerce, has a huge impact on members of Congress. It was very interesting that in 2009, when we were very close to getting something done, the House passed wax monarchy, the Senate couldn't pass anything. There's a political scientist at Harvard named Theda Skocpol, who wrote an over 100-page criticism about why we failed in 2009. And at the heart of her criticism was, she said that the support for legislation was only in the Beltway and it needed to be back in the district. And we need to continue to show members of Congress that they will be supported at home if they do the right thing. The third is covering every key district. We still need a lot of strength in the South. Interestingly enough, Kevin Brady, whew, who is clearly not Kevin Bacon, is the chairman of the Ways and Means Department. He's in Houston. We have 404 chapters in Houston now. One of those chapters is made up of entirely of people from the extraction industry, so they're all former ExxonMobil, Chevron, et cetera, employees, which gives us a chance to get at him in a way that we don't. So we're very focused on making sure that in every district we can have very productive, effective meetings with members. And then the last one, in terms of a main priority, growth and volunteer engagement. And this was the one where we really had the longest discussion, because there are tools out there right now where we could probably bring in another 1 million or 2 million people quickly. So we asked ourselves, do we want to just go for raw numbers, or do we want to go something where when people touch this organization, they have the feel of the CCL organization where your voice can be heard, where someone will get back to you, where someone is committed to your growth in the organization. And we decided that engaged people was way more important than numbers. There are really good tools, and at some point we decide to go to the direction of rapidly trying to get 1 million or 5 million people, it could be done. But the question is, could we do that and maintain what was so beautifully said by all of you in relationship to the values? And we decided that engaged volunteers was way more important than raw numbers. Then we have 2 secondary focuses. One is diversity outreach and recruitment. We're making an offer to hire a diversity coordinator that hopefully will be on board this week. And certainly we would like CCL to look more like our country does. And then also we have a states policy coordinator also, so that if we can use states as a way of putting additional pressure on the federal government by, at some point, if more states start to put carbon pricing mechanisms in place, businesses are simply going to go to Congress and say, I can't function under 20 sets of rules. We need to get something consistent. So the emphasis on states is more to put pressure on the feds. It's also awesome anytime a price is put in place. So we established some principles. If we were going to support state efforts, how would we determine which state efforts? One is they had to be effective at reducing greenhouse emissions beyond existing policies, that they would protect low-income households from price increases, are politically viable for that state. So we're not going to use any energy somewhere where we see in that state nothing's going to happen, so why should you spend any of your energy and time? And that also harmonize well with carbon fee and dividend at a federal level or other state carbon pricing mechanisms. The other criteria that we have for evaluating states is there has to be a separate organization. So for instance, in Massachusetts, there's something called climate exchange. So that if CCL volunteers are working on the effort in Massachusetts, they're doing it under the banner of climate exchange so that we don't ever confuse what we're doing, and we know anytime we're lobbying as CCL, we're doing it for federal carbon fee and dividend. Okay, we're also, because the Climate Solutions Caucus is important to us, we've looked at there may be times that we choose to support efforts that come out of the Climate Solutions Caucus that don't even have anything to do with pricing. But what it's really about is having the caucus be successful. Having the caucus actually do something meaningful is really important. And I think Mr. Corbella laid it out correctly. What he said initially is we simply needed to get Republicans and Democrats talking to each other, and we've done that. The second thing is we needed to ward off some bad legislation, and they've done that. But he said, really, we're now at the point where we have to start introducing meaningful policy. So what we've determined is there may be times that we'll support issues just to help the caucus itself or to deepen our relationship with members of the caucus. Now, in that effort, because of our DC staff is getting bigger, probably we'll be able to do that without having to ask you to do anything. It's probably something we can just do through our DC office, and those of us in the field will just keep focusing on what we're focusing on. Okay, a couple other things I want to share with you. So twice a year we get together as a staff, and here's the interesting discussion we have. We say, okay, once again, we're twice as big as we were at this time last year. Are the organization's systems, structures, our way of working with the organization, is it current with what's happening? Is it out in front of what's about to happen, which is going to be twice this size again next year? Or are we 3 or 4 years behind? We usually start with, we're probably 3 or 4 years behind. So we get together and we say, okay, how can we continue to evolve the organization to be a match for what's happening? So one of the things we did last year is we broke into little functioning teams, which include management, volunteers, which you can see we're a volunteer organization, so that's where the most number of staffs, communication, administration, government affairs, fundraising, and strategy. Now you notice on the strategy there's no team lead and there's no team members, right? It's a secret team. I don't even let the other staff know which staff's on it. Mostly it's because I didn't want some people to feel like they were more valued than other people, so we'll rotate people on and off it, but right now it's kind of fun having a secret team where we discuss strategy on a regular basis. I also want to mention that we have 2 organizations, so we actually have 2 financial statements we manage every quarter. We have 2 boards of directors. We have, they're 2 separate entities. There's Citizens Climate Education and Citizens Climate Lobby. In terms of Citizens Climate Education, the chairman of that is someone named Scott Leckman. Marshall was the chairman for both organizations for a long time, and many of you are aware that a few years ago, Marshall had a health scare that scared him. And he thought that he just couldn't be responsible for the organization being the chairman. And okay, I can't keep my promises. So he turned to someone that he worked with for decades, that he trusted. And Scott Leckman is a really, really remarkable man. And he's really stepped in to fill in. Marshall's still on the board, but we're really lucky to have Scott as the chairman of Citizens Climate Education. You'll see Marshall's on that board. Mark Tabbert, who spoke earlier, is on that board. Claudine Schneider is a former Republican member of Congress from Rhode Island. Sandra Turner is a climate scientist. She's in this region. She would ordinarily be here, but she has the flu. And Zena, however you pronounce her last name, comes from Wall Street. So she's actually really making some nice connections with us for people that I don't have a lot of access to. Citizens Climate Lobby, the chairman is Ross Astoria. Ross is a law professor. He's been published in the area of a border adjustment. He's the person who also puts on our CCL boot camp in advance of the conference every year. Last year was the first one. We'll do this one again. He's just the ultimate policy wonk, and really I relate to the CCL board more as a kind of policy board, even though it is technically a governing board. It's really a lot where I go to talk about, what comes next after carbon fee and dividend, what are our potential negotiating points that we hope to be in a swirling fight with Congress about any day now. Where do we give? Where do we hold firm? The other members of that board are Marshall, George Hetzel, Jerry Hinkle, who's training as an economist, and Mary Selkirk, who is a godsend for both the boards. She also heads up what we call our governance and nominating committee. Okay, and then just regarding the 2 organizations, CCL is really what we're known as, but it's where about 20% of the income comes in because people don't get a write-off when they donate to CCL. Let me just say though, for those of you who do donate to CCL, we're extremely grateful. Being able to add Ben and Andres in DC this year made a huge difference. They have all kinds of friends on the Hill. They have all kinds of friends that have been in DC for forever, and it really allowed us to move the ball down the road a long ways. CCE, that's where the majority of our income comes through. That's where we pay all of our expenses. It's 80% of our budget, and it's what many of you donated to. And let me just say, for those of you who were able to donate last year and donate this year, so we started that process with Leslie Beatty about 1.5 years ago. And she said she didn't come up with anything. She simply said what was already there. And everything she's touched since then looks like the focus work. Everything she touches. And so some of you have made comments about maybe we should call it a rebate rather than a dividend. Well, Leslie has this extensive marketing background. And because of the money you brought in, we were able to bring her on staff a month ago. And it's just been a godsend for all of us. We're really, really happy. So thank you for all that. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the two organizations. Okay. Just a couple other quick things I want to do. So there is a book on the book table called Black Box Thinking. And Black Box Thinking, the subtitle of it is Why Some People Learn from Failure and Some Never Do. It starts with the basic contrast of the black box that you find in an airline, so that when things go wrong with airlines, when there's airplane crashes, we find out everything. We find out what happened technically with the airplane. We find out what happened with the in the cockpit. You can actually hear their voices. So it starts there, where every time there's been a major crash in airlines, it's actually moved the entire airline industry forward significantly because they learn so much. He then follows that right up by contrasting it with healthcare, which in healthcare, as we all know, hundreds of thousands of people die unnecessarily because the culture of healthcare is one that tries to pretend that mistakes don't happen. You know, it was eerie as I was reading that chapter, because 4 years ago, I had a lot of trouble with my shoulder, and I went to the doctor when I finally couldn't get my bag in the upper thing at the airplane. You know, like it hurt like hell for a year, but like then when it mattered, you know, I couldn't get on the airplane anymore without somebody having to help me. So we get an MRI, and I go in and with the orthopedic surgeon, and he looks at the MRI with me, and he says, "See, a picture tells 1,000 words, doesn't it?" I'm looking at an MRI, right? I see nothing. And so he says, "Clearly you have a rotator cuff tear." I'm like, okay, that's not what I was hoping to hear, and I don't see anything, but you're the orthopedic surgeon. So we schedule the surgery, we get in there, they get into my shoulder, and he finds out there's actually no tear. What there is a frozen shoulder. So I go back to my primary care doctor, and I go to the orthopedic surgeon, and I said, how did we get that wrong? And they said things like, well, sometimes you'll be better in 2 months, and sometimes you'll be better in 3 months. So then I go to the other doctor. You know, this is a pretty big mistake of a diagnosis. Oh, you know, you seem to be pretty. It was like I hadn't even asked the question. As I'm reading that chapter about healthcare, he keeps talking about a culture that says, well, people just die. And so we haven't learned very quickly in healthcare to improve like we did in the aeronautical industry. He did point out that in the cases where there was dramatic decreases in medical errors, is where they eliminated the culture of blame in organizations. So he spends a lot of time, and I'm going to get into this a little bit tomorrow also, because I think it's important that we be an organization that isn't afraid of failing so that we can learn from our mistakes rather than worrying about what might go wrong. But he also gets into something called incremental change, where some people who've been able to produce dramatic increases in performance did so by not trying to tackle everything, but by simply trying to improve every little piece of what they were doing. And in this case, he talked about a specific Tour de France team, and then development where they dramatically reduced extreme poverty in places around the world. And that in those cases, rather than trying to tackle everything, they just went to see what every little thing that could be done. So how does that apply to you and I? How it applies to you and I is, I'm going to ask you at your table in just a moment to identify one of our 5 levers of political will, lobbying, grassroots, grass tops, media, chapter development. What is one thing that you could take on this year that you could just be a little bit better at in your chapter? I'm going to ask you to discuss that. You're not going to have a ton of time, unfortunately. But if all of us could just improve one of those levers, you know, media, lobbying, grass tops, grassroots, chapter development, if each of us could improve a little bit in one of those areas, the assertion of the book was that's the kind of thing that creates transformational change. Rather than trying to change everything, you fix one little thing. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 minutes at your tables, and what I'm going to ask you to do is just each one of you identify what's an area that you could go to work on and how could you improve it, but you've only got 3 minutes, sorry. Okay. Okay, could you just please thank the people at your table for listening to you there? Could you just say thank you? Thank you. Okay, very nice. You could just wrap that up. Thank you so much. I wanted to I wanted to get you thinking about that now so that over the course of the day and a half, you could think about whatever you're hearing, whoever you're talking to, whatever you're looking at, that could help you on whatever piece you said you're going to take on. Obviously, you're not limited to the one you identified or maybe a couple you identified, but let's use the next day and a half to equip ourselves to just every one of us make a little bit of improvement in one of those areas. I think one of the most remarkable things that I heard when everybody was sharing in response to Marshall sharing the values, and I apologize for not remembering your name, but the woman who said, we choose optimism. Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, we choose optimism. To me, that's an incredibly powerful statement, because sometimes you feel optimistic and sometimes you don't, right? But to say you choose optimism is like saying, I get up, I put on my clothes, and I choose optimism. There's reason to be encouraged now. I wish I could tell you more of some of the signals we're getting from DC right now, and we've certainly been teased before of people saying, okay, I'm ready to pull the switch, and then they didn't. So I'm very encouraged about what we're hearing. So in addition to choosing optimism, I believe there's a reason to be optimistic, okay? All right, let's have a great conference, everybody. Let's see you next session.